Today's reading is from Exodus, chapter 24, verses 12 through 18. It's on page 65 in the Old Testament in your pew Bibles. At Mount Sinai, Moses experienced the presence of God for 40 days and 40 nights. The glory of the Lord settled on the mountain, and on the seventh day God called out to Moses. On the mountain, God gave Moses the stone tablets inscribed with the 10 Commandments. The reading begins at verse 12. The Lord said to Moses, "Come up to me on the mountain and wait there, and I will give you the tablets of stone with the law and the commandment, which I have written for their institution." So Moses set out with his assistant Joshua, and Moses went up into the mountain of God. To the elders he had said, "Wait for us until we come to you again, for Aaron and Hur are with you. Whoever has a dispute may go to them." Then Moses went up on the mountain, and the cloud covered the mountain. The glory of the Lord settled on Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered it for 6 days. On the seventh day he called to Moses out of the cloud. Now the appearance of the glory of the Lord was like a devouring fire on the top of the mountain in the sight of the people of Israel. Moses entered the cloud and went up on the mountain. Moses was on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights.
The Holy Gospel according to Matthew, the 17th chapter. Jesus took with him Peter and James and his brother John and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them. And his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly there appeared to them Moses and Elijah talking with them. Then Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will make 3 dwellings here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." While he was still speaking, suddenly a bright cloud overshadowed them. And from the cloud a voice said, "This is my son, the beloved. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." When the disciples heard this, they fell on the ground and were overcome by fear. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, "Get up and do not be afraid." And when they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus himself alone. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus ordered them, "Tell no one about the vision until after the Son of Man has been raised from the dead." The Gospel of our Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. Please be seated. You will never be the same again. Your world will be just a little bit bigger. Your eyes will see things that, they have not seen before. Your thoughts and perceptions will change to the point where people who know you will look at you and go, "What happened?" Birth of a child, maybe a grandchild. First kiss. That book you read, you know the one that I'm talking about. That class you took. First job, cancer, divorce. A cutting insult too close to home from someone that you love so much. A career change at 43. A corn dog at the Minnesota State Fair. I'll take your word for it, though, because I've never been, and you can shame me after the service is over. But there are some things that you cannot walk back from. You cannot come back from them. And I want you to think about it like this. I'm going to flip through a couple here. Here we go. You are moving along swimmingly in life. Things are going well. You have a handle on all of life. And there is a normalcy known as routine, and you love your routines. And then that thing happens, and all of a sudden, you and the world, it's different. Life will never go back to what was before that point in time. Even if you want it to, it can't go back. In fact, it's better to speak about this as your life pre-event and post-event, because that's how much your life has been changed at this point. And the fact is that there are thousands of these events that take place in a lifetime. And they are not all grand events. And what I mean by that is this. Yes, your world changes forever when you drive home from the hospital with an extra human being in the back seat that you didn't have there before. It's crazy, and you're not sure what to do. That is a massive life-changing thing, but that's not the only thing that I'm talking about. So, those of you who have been here a while know now that I often include stories about myself in these little talks. And that's because the story of our faith lives in our lives. That's where the story of our faith, that's where its home is at, in our lives. And the only life that I can adequately speak to is my own. The hope is that you might have similar experiences of what it means to be a human being and relate. So let me tell you about the first time I experienced an event that I could not come back from. It happened to me when I was pretty young. In that time, my world was very small, mostly filled with immediate family and a few close friends who were pretty much exactly like me. We were all very similar. There were certain assumptions then that I simply took for granted, and those assumptions went like this. Assumption number one, normal families. And do you even like how I started that? Normal families, right? Whatever normal is. But for me, normal families had 2 parents and a sibling and were safe. Second assumption, help is always available even if you don't ask for it. It's just there. It's lovely. And assumption number 3, money is serious, but it's plentiful. You always have enough. That's how life was. So one day, when I was in school, there was a girl sitting at my table during reading time, and she was crying. I remember that. I don't remember what grade it was, and some of the other fine details, because time has made those pieces fuzzy. But this next piece, I do remember very clearly, because it's been burned in my mind. I asked her why she was crying, what was wrong, and she said that her dad had to go away, and that she and her mom had to move to a new place because they did not have enough money, and she was sad, and she was scared. And as she's talking, none of this makes sense to me. None of this does. I did not have a reference for what she was saying, and so I looked at her as if she was an alien. I think I made her feel worse, as if something was wrong with her. Later, I learned that what had actually happened was that her dad was not a safe person and had been arrested for abuse. And she and her mom had to move to a small apartment, the only apartment that they could afford, far away from our school. And at that time, my world changed, because apparently not all families have 2 parents. Apparently, not all families are safe. Help is not always available, even if you don't ask for it, and money is not plentiful, at least for everyone. And after I say this, you might look at me and say, well, obviously, right? That's welcome to the world, Chad. But I was young, and I didn't have any other experience. And because of this, there was no going back for me. I could no longer go back to the way life was before. My world had changed, and so had I. And small events like this, they happen thousands of times over the course of one's life. And while small and on the surface they're seemingly insignificant, they are massively transformative. Jesus' disciples are actually going through a very similar process. They have been following Jesus, but they really don't get it. They don't. They think they do, but they don't. They're looking for something big. They're looking for someone great. They trusted that God would remember God's promises and set their community free from the Roman oppression which was happening during their lifetime. And that would require a big event from a big person. And at first, Jesus seems like he's the real deal. He's going to be the one to do this, the answer to their hopes. But as time goes on, many begin to question this. They begin to question Jesus' methods, his actions, even his understanding and what he has to say about God. Even some of Jesus' closest disciples and friends seem to be wanting more than Jesus can give them. And so one day, the story that we read today, Jesus takes with him his innermost circle of friends. And they go on a retreat of sorts. They get away. They go up to a mountain. And while on this mountain, they have some kind of experience. It's really hard to describe. And so authors use words like light and white and brightness and overshadowing to get at what they're experiencing. And there are visions of Moses and Elijah, great Jewish figures talking with Jesus. And just like that, it's over. It lasts a moment and it's gone. But whatever they experienced, however they would describe it, it would change them. The world would not be the same after that. They had experienced the greatness and the presence of God in the person of Jesus, who actually spent his days with the poor, the sick, the hurting, and who spoke of love, grace, and forgiveness as the greatest commandments, which were more powerful for addressing oppression and the needs of this world than all of the power and strength that comes from armies and swords and violence. And while the disciples' brothers, or Jewish brothers and sisters, while they still maintained the belief that God would deliver them from their ordeal through this strength and might of a military or religious strongman, Jesus' disciples, they began to see differently. They could not go back to the life they knew before because they now knew that the essence of God is made known in self-sacrificial love and service to others, even their enemies, as Jesus taught. And this wasn't new. It had always been this way. It just took an experience for them to see differently. This kind of story is actually really common in the Bible. In fact, Moses has something happen very, very similar to him. Don't know if you know this story or not, but Moses, early on, before he went to Egypt and before the movie was made about him, he was a shepherd. I mean, he was living life. And he encounters God in a really hard to describe kind of way one day while he's out in the middle of nowhere. And because he's not sure how to describe it, he says, well, it was like a burning bush that wouldn't go out. And in this experience, he experiences that the ground he is on, the place where he is at in the middle of nowhere, that the presence of God is there, that it radiates God. And the question that you're left with after that story is this: did the presence of God just suddenly show up out of nowhere? Or was the presence of God always there? And it just took an experience for Moses to realize this. Regardless, this experience would change Moses. He would never be the same. He could never go back to the life he previously knew. Personally, I believe this is still the way that God works very often in our lives. Birth of a child, maybe a grandchild. First kiss, that book you read, that class you took. First job, cancer, divorce. A cutting insult too close to home from someone who you deeply care about. A career change at middle age. The ordinary times and places of life. The joys and struggles that we encounter on a regular basis, where people have walked with us, loved us, forgiven us, helped us understand grace. These are the moments where we experience the essence of God, which leaves us changed people. You can't go back to the way that things were before. Believe it or not, that is actually one of the primary purposes of our faith. That through the giving and receiving of the way of Christ, that we are transformed, that we are different people. And it's hard to describe such experiences, and so people have used words like, it felt like peace and wholeness and a sense of goodness and aliveness and a burning in my soul as a stranger paid for my gas when I realized I had forgotten my wallet at home. As my son said, I love you, and my son never says those words. As my grandchild held my hand while I was in the hospital. As my church served a meal to hungry people. As a spouse gave a final kiss to her husband before he died. I mean, you won't be the same as your heart begins to beat more and more in line with God's heart. And that is okay, because you will find in this process a sense of joy and gratitude and the presence of God in the very ordinary of things that completely transform your life in ways that you cannot yet understand. In the story of Jesus' transfiguration, we find ourselves transformed to live more and more in tune with God's dream for this world. And that is the good news we hear today. Thanks be to God for that. Amen.